Hello, what's up? It's Insomniac, and even though it isn't my main role, I've done quite a lot of tanking, mostly for dungeons. Getting into tanking took me a good bit of time, practice, and also help from my friends. To make it easier for others trying to get into the role, I made this very basic beginner's guide. Mind, I won't go over any advanced content like specific setups or classes. This would just be kept to a very basic level to help with the foundations of tanking in group content. So let's get started. First off, let's look into your purpose as a tank. It's your job to take aggro of enemies so they won't hit your group mates, position the enemy, stack and control enemies if there are multiple, debuff the enemy and buff your group so your team can do more damage, and also of course stay alive so you can keep taking the heavy hits for your team. You use a combination of your skills and gear to achieve this, so let's look at these goals one by one. Taking aggro. To take aggro, you need to use a skill that applies taunt. There are multiple options for this, but the most commonly used ones are the melee taunt Pierce Armor from the Sword and Shield skill line, and the range taunt Inner Rage from the Undaunted skill line. When entering a fight, always try to figure out which enemies are the scariest ones for your team and taunt them first. In a boss fight, most of the time this will be the boss. When entering a trash fight, so an ad fight without a boss, most of the time you can tell which enemies are most dangerous by their size. Generally, anything big is scary. Enemies with two-handed weapons also usually have hard-hitting attacks that can oftentimes take out your DDs and healer in one blow. Don't forget ranged enemies also. They like to stay off to the side and get free hits in on your team if you don't control them. At times it can be hard to taunt your intended enemy, especially when they are in the back chasing teammates and other enemies are crowding you. In those cases where they obscure your line of sight, you can tap target and select the enemy you want to taunt. This will save you resources as you won't have to spam taunt to maybe hit the correct target. Keeping aggro is your priority, so don't forget to always refresh taunt in time so the boss or other enemies don't run off and start fighting your DDs or healer. Lastly, let's have a quick look at over-taunting. This only applies if you have multiple people in your group that can taunt the enemy, for example in a trial. If an enemy gets taunted 3 times in quick succession by different people, they will become over-taunted. This makes them immune to taunt for a while. Because of this, you should never spam taunt in content with multiple tanks. If you are the only tank, it doesn't matter and you can taunt as much as you want. Positioning the enemy. When you have aggro of a dangerous enemy, it's important to immediately turn them away from your group. Many enemies in the game have cleave attacks that hit anything in front of them. This can come in either a cone shape, rectangle, or whatever aligns with the enemy's animation. Consequently, having bosses or other mobs face the group can kill your teammates or force them to start playing defensively by moving out of position. You're the only one who should be taking these cleave hits, so always face the boss away from your group. Additionally, certain abilities, passives and champion point nodes will increase your DD's damage while they flank an enemy. So even if they don't cleave, you should always turn enemies away as they will die faster. After turning them away, the next step is to keep the enemy as static as possible in their positioning. Of course, some of them run away or jump around in a way you can't influence, but you should never run around with an aggroed enemy on you. Your DDs use ground-based abilities to maximize their DPS, and your healer will put down ground-based heals. By moving the boss out of these abilities when unnecessary, you force your healer and DDs to recast them, effectively losing a big chunk of their value. By having to refresh those abilities early, you also force your group to spend more resources, which can result in both death due to the lack of magicka or stamina to shield, block or dodge, and a complete lack of damage. Sustaining resources for you will also become more difficult due to not being in the proximity of synergies and ground-based heals, as well as the extended fight time due to the DPS loss you caused. So even if you are scared, moving around will only make it worse. The next step of positioning is to be aware of your group and the area you are fighting in. Many DDs are melee players and will have to stay close to the boss in order to hit them. If there's a big AoE on the floor, you should always move the boss out of it, or they simply won't be able to hit it. If you are afraid to move the enemy out of your team's ground-based abilities, just watch where the boss's back is facing. A lot of times you don't need to move him very far for your DDs to still get hits in. Just remember to not just move out of the AoE yourself and then leave the boss in it. This would force your group to stack on top of you, leaving them vulnerable for cleave attacks and reducing damage because flanking is no longer possible. Always keep the enemy's back unobstructed and free of AoEs so your team can safely stand there. Stacking and controlling the enemy. Only taunting enemies will usually not be enough. Melee adds will of course run to you. which will usually cause him to stack nicely without needing to do anything else, but ranged enemies won't make it as easy. They will stay on the side and keep on shooting safely out of range of your group's damage. This of course applies to both add and boss fights. To make sure they die, you have to pull them in. This can be done by using the skill Silver Leash from the Fighter's Guild skill line, which every class has access to. Or class-specific skills like the Dragonknights' Chains or the Warden's Portals. After that, you can also keep them stunned in place to make sure they don't run away. Different classes have different ways of doing so. Examples are the Dragonknights' Choking Talons, the Nightblades' Mass Hysteria, or the Necros' Agony Totem. But besides that, every class can use Turn Evil from the Fighter's Guild skill line. A stun is not always necessary to control add packs. Sometimes slows are enough and will give your team enough time to kill them before they run away, or will give you enough time to taunt everything. Debuffing the enemy and buffing your group. Being a tank is not just about being tanky. It's also about buffing your team and debuffing the enemy. This part of your job has a much bigger impact on your group's overall DPS than you would probably expect. And maybe you won't care about damage this much, but higher damage also helps your survivability. If your group does more damage, the fight is over faster, or certain sections of the fight don't last as long. This means you will need to spend much less resources for staying alive. There's a wide array of gear sets available to help you give many unique buffs or debuffs which have a huge impact on your team. But besides sets, there's one very important thing many tanks sadly tend to forget about. Penetration. Penetration is the most important thing you can give to your group. On a very basic level it works like this. Every enemy in the game, be it add or boss, has armor. This armor reduces the damage they take from anything hitting them. Your DD's damage will be reduced, depending on the armor the enemy has. Penetration is what reduces this armor, and optimally you want to reduce it to 0 or a value close to it. Of course you don't need to do this alone. There are many things your DDs can do for themselves to help. But as a tank you are responsible for the biggest chunk of armor reduction. You also have some very simple solutions and debuffs in your toolkit which you can apply to effectively turn your enemy's full plate armor into a set of comfy pajamas your DDs won't have any trouble punching through. Including the following things into your toolkit is necessary and will be a massive help for your group. The Melee Taunt Pierce Armor. Your Melee Taunt applies 2 massive armor debuffs, Major and Minor Breach. These are absolutely essential for your group. All you have to do is keep the enemy taunted with the skill, and you don't even need to think about it. Keep in mind that range taunt does not apply these debuffs, so whenever you range taunt an enemy, make sure you melee taunt it when it comes into range. If you don't melee taunt an enemy, your DDs essentially have bubble wrap around their weapons while hitting the enemy, and will do barely any damage compared to what they could be doing. For AoE fights, you should always slot Razor Caltrops from the Alliance War Assault skill line. It will apply Major Breach in a big AoE to everything stepping into it. If you have time to buff still, it's good to melee taunt as many targets as possible, prioritizing tanky targets, as Caltrops, unlike melee taunt, does not apply Minor Breach. Blockade of Elements with Crusher Enchant. For almost every situation you should have an ice staff on your back bar that allows you to use the skill Blockade of Elements. Once on the floor, Blockade of Elements will keep reapplying your staff's enchantment on the enemy as long as the skill is up and ticking. The enchant is the important part in this case, Crusher. Crusher reduces your enemy's armor and becomes even stronger with the infused trait on your staff. Upgrading the enchant and weapon to gold will help this even further. Always have Blockade of Elements on your main target. This will add to your melee taunt's armor reduction and remove even more of your enemy's armor. Other types of destruction staves work too, but using an ice staff will allow you to block just as well on your back bar as on your front bar, as long as you have points in the Ancient Knowledge passive in the Destruction Staff skill line. The ice staff's other passives and abilities work well with the tank toolkit too. Additionally, when using an ice staff to tank, it is important to not have any points in the Tri-Focus passive of the Destruction Staff skill line, as it will make you block with magicka instead of stamina while using a staff. This sounds good at first, but can easily kill you in content when using your magicka to buff, debuff, and to keep yourself alive. To recap this. The staff has to be in the infused trait with a Crusher enchantment on it. Of course, I know golding out gear can be rough, especially when starting out, but if you are able to do so, prioritize making this weapon golden, or at least to upgrade the enchant, as golden enchantments are the cheapest upgrades in the game. Usually these 2 points are already enough to help your DDs to fix the rest of their penetration by themselves, especially if they're using light armor, and will be enough for dungeons. If they use medium armor, it will still not be enough, but they will be able to work out the rest of their armor reduction by making other sacrifices. If you want to help your group further so they don't have to sacrifice as much, you can always use gear sets to reduce armor further. A very nice option for this is the Crimson Oath set from the dungeon The Dread Cellar. Another option is the Monster Helmet Drummer skill from the Volenfell dungeon. Besides penetration sets, there are other good buff sets as well. Of course, a lot of good gear comes from trials, but you can easily make a great setup without utilizing any trial sets. Besides the ones I already mentioned, some examples of dungeon sets you could use are Turning Tide from Shipwright's Regret, Arceus' Genius from Stone Garden, Drake's Rush from Black Drake Villa, and Serpent's Disdain, which is actually craftable. Besides gear sets, each class brings unique passives or abilities to buff or debuff to the table. For example, the Dragonknights Stone Giant, the Nightblades Lotus Fan, the Necros Empowering Grasp, or the Warden's Fetcher Infection. Have a look through your preferred class's passives and skills and you will find something unique to give to your group. Some of these take a bit of practice to apply properly, so don't be discouraged if it doesn't work out for you right away. It's also okay if you would prefer not to use them while getting used to the feel of tanking. Don't be scared to give them a try though, as they will make a big difference for your group, especially when getting into trial content with a much bigger group. Additionally, your ultimate is also very important for your group. Aggressive Horn from the Alliance War skill line is a must-have for every tank on dungeon and trial content, as it doesn't just give a big resource increase to your group, but also provides everyone around you with major force, which increases their critical damage by 20%. It's often underestimated just how much of a difference a tank buffing and debuffing actually does for the group, so I gathered some friends to help me record this direct comparison. In the left clip I'm wearing no damage buffing sets, and I'm not using any damage buffing abilities or anything that applies major or minor breach. I'm simply holding the boss in position. In the right clip I'm wearing a damage buffing setup as well as providing penetration, using Warhorn and skills that debuff the enemy further. The 3DDs are using the exact same gear and skills in both clips. Staying alive. Now with all of this out of the way, let's look into some things that will make it easier for you to stay alive. Let's start with some hints the game gives you, as well as some settings that will make your life easier. Try to avoid AoEs. Just because you are tanky doesn't mean you should be sitting in them for an extended amount of time, as it will still cost you resources to survive them. On base settings, AoEs can be very hard to see. With the simple brightness change in the game settings, you'll have a much easier time with it. Besides that, the game will also give you cues if scary attacks are about to happen. Yellow lines coming from the enemy indicates a heavy attack coming in. These attacks are usually going to kill you or drop you very low on HP, so make sure to block them or dodge them. Red lines coming from the enemy indicates that they're channeling a devastating attack, or a buff or heal for the enemy adds. This has to be interrupted by bashing them. Other than that, your main defense is of course blocking, which will reduce incoming damage massively, especially if done on a sword and shield bar, or with a frost staff. However, you can only block damage as long as you have enough stamina to do so, and additionally your stamina will not regenerate as long as you are holding block. During a fight, pay attention to the gaps between the enemy's attacks. During those gaps you can heavy attack to regenerate your stamina. You also don't need to block every attack thrown at you. This is highly dependent on the fight, but some normal enemy attacks don't hurt as much, especially if you have a healer out-healing the little damage you are taking. With some practice you will get a good feel for when you should block and when you don't need to, which will give you some time to regenerate resources. Roll dodging is of course always an option as well. However, this will trigger a fatigue for a couple of seconds, which will make your following roll dodges more and more costly, so don't overdo it or just wait out the cooldown when possible. Another way to stay alive is self-heals and shields. Each class provides their own unique skills for healing themselves. You should always utilize those skills and not entirely rely on your healer, as it's your job to heal yourself as well. An important self-buff to keep up is Major Resolve, which will buff your resistances, reducing incoming damage. Every class has a way of providing Major Resolve, so have a look at your preferred class's ability kit. Additionally, every class has access to Balance from the Major skill line, which will provide the buff as well. If you still have space on your bars and you feel like you need some additional tankiness, you can always slot Revealing Flare from the Alliance War support skill line. This ability does not have to be used, or even morphed. Slotting it will make you take 10% less damage as long as you are on the bar you have it slotted on. Another thing that will help you with staying alive is of course add-ons. There are many useful add-ons, but I will boil this down to the most essential ones for tanking. Code's combat alerts will call out mechanics for you, so you know when to react to them. Additionally, it will tell you when a heavy attack is targeting you and indicate when it will hit, so you know when to dodge or block. Untaunted will indicate which enemies you currently have taunt off and how long it will last still. Action Duration Reminder will add timers to your abilities to show how long they will be active for, so you know when to refresh them. Unlike the base game timer, it also shows timers of the abilities of the bar you are not currently on. This should cover the basics of tanking. If you have any questions, please don't be shy to leave them in the comments and I will do my best to answer them. If you're interested in guides like this for other roles, check out my beginner's guide for DDs and healers, or even my guides to recognizing buff sets from a damage dealer's POV. Besides that, if you have any requests for further guides, please drop them in the comments as well. Also, if you would like to see more specific tanking setups for different classes, I'd like to recommend Hyperiox's channel to you. His guides are very good and will give you the best possible setups if you want to optimize. I'll leave links to his channel and my other guides in the description. As always, thanks for watching, have a good one, and I'll see you guys in the next video.